Good morning. Hemshech Chaim Beis, Volume 2. We're on page 1180. Okay. So, what we learned yesterday, what we've established is that Navoida, we're talking about in the Adam, as he began this discourse, this mimer, that within each of us, we have these different levels of perspectives. Daas Tachton, Daas Elyon, what he calls Yichud Tato, Yichud, the lower unity, the higher unity. And we've now, the Rebbe Rashab has delineated three levels. One is Daas Tachton, which in Avodah Shiluv Havaya Ba'adnai, the Yichud Havaya L'Elikim, that we discover the godliness within existence in the Yesh, that instead of it being a self-contained ego, our existence, we direct it and we discover the divine that's within it. Page 1179, he spelled that out. Which in the language that he used earlier in the Maimer was the level of Dibur. Dibur is how God speaks and creates the universe with words that allow for and create a separate entity. But now the separate entity is reconnecting. It's like the words are reconnecting to the thought and all the way back to the source. As we learned, that's the first level. And that consists of a work of V'yadaita Das, to come to a Das Tachton, which is that you come to a recognition, hergish, a recognition and a feeling of this Ayin Eliki, of this divine Ayin, this divine energy. And that brings to emotions, which in turn brings to the work of the birur, of the separating and the clarifying and the elevating and discovering the divine within existence. That's concealed within existence. Then comes level 2, which is Shiluv Adnai Bahavaya, which is not from Yesh to Ayin, but from a level of awareness, you're coming to higher states of awareness. And that is to discover the divine that's beyond Atzilus. So the Kalim of Atzilus being absorbed in and being encompassed in that which is higher than they are, and the Ur that's higher than the Kalim, the Uris and the Kalim. And Navede, he called that Ru'usa Deliba, in contrast to level 1, which was an Aveda al Pitam Vadas, which means something that we can contemplate on, and we grow in our contemplation, our awareness. He also included, I should mention just as an aside, well, it's not an aside, he mentioned it's also in level 1, the contemplation that the concealment is not a true concealment. Now you've come to contemplation, which is called Ru'usa Deliba, the desire of the heart. That's Lamaila Mitam Vadas. And here he cites the Tanya Perik Yutes, that the soul naturally, chafetza, well, it doesn't say naturally, desires to be attached and connect to its source, even though it will become nullified there, like a flame in its source. And as the Bitli calls Chochmah Nefesh, a little later down, this seems to be the level of Chaya, not Nefesh Ruch, Neshama Chaya of the Neshama, which is a makif, but it's still not the ultimate. Then he calls the next third level Daas Elyon, the Amitis. The true Daas Elyon is a state of the Etzem HaNeshama itself, connecting to its source. It's not coming through a contemplation. It's not coming through Avodah. Well, the Avodah is to reveal it. But what we're revealing is an essential connection between the essence of the soul and the essence of Ein Sof. And this he calls Tachlis HaYidiyah Shalei Neda, that we're coming to know the unknowable. Now we're not involved with any type of comprehension or contemplation. As he said, that it's Iskashus Ramoka Boim L'Dei. So there's a level where Hasaga, contemplation and comprehension leads to a higher level of bittul. That would be Chaya, that would be level 2. But level 3, as he says, is not even anything connected to hasaga, not even negating, even hasaga sashlila, meaning negating something, even that not. And the words he uses, this is what? That the core soul recognizes and feels, identifies with and feels the etzmus ein sof, because that's his sheirish shemakir. Not through his bonanus, also not in the haflah of Eir Ein Sof, which means there's bonanus in God's grandiosity, which we need like level 2. It says, bonanus leads to makif of chaya. But now we're talking about makif of yechida. Okay. And he compares it to the recognition of the soul, what he called Mekodesh Nefesh. It recognizes like something that the heart, Lev Yedei, your heart just knows it. Without an understanding, you just instinctively know this. Yeah. And that's Amiti's Daas Elyon, the Ayin Amiti from Pnimis Atzmus Ein Sof. That's where we stopped. So I want to just add one or two things just to clarify. Now, I mentioned yesterday that I was trying to understand the difference between Ru'usa Deliba, level 2, which is called Ru'usa Deliba. And I remembered now, once I thought about it, that there's actually a mimer that I want to refer to. It's a mimer, Ela Mates Tafresh Ayin Gimel. It's back on page 314 in volume 1, chapter 1, Kufnu Ches, 158. And it's actually vital to understand this better, because there he talks more at length, these levels. Also the haflah concept. So let me just share with you what he says there, because I believe it'll help understand what we're learning now. And it's actually, there's a letter from the Rebbe that cites this mimer in explaining a question that the Rebbe was asked about Ru'usa Deliba. Ru'usa Deliba is mentioned 3 times in Tanya, maybe more. But what we know is, what the ones in this letter at least, he addresses chapter 17, chapter 39, and chapter 44. Yud Zayin Lamed Tes Mem Dalet. And the questioner asked the Rebbe whether which one is, when in chapter 39 he says, canal, does he mean chapter 17 or chapter 44? So the Rebbe explains, and this is based on this Maimer and Ayin Beis that I'm describing, that Ru'usa Deliba, there are different levels. Ru'usa Deliba literally means the desire of the heart. But what does that mean? What level is that? So generally it's 2 levels. The Rebbe spells out 3 levels there, but for our practical purposes, it's 2. One is that it is born from, and it comes from the intellectual process of a contemplation. And we've discussed this a number of times in the Maimarim here, that there's 2 ways an emotion affects us. One is an emotion that's instinctive and it's hardwired within us. We have certain emotions that do not need contemplation. Let's say the natural love of parent to child, the natural fear, let's say, of fire. This does not need contemplation. The body and the very soul of a person is aware of certain things, and we have emotional reaction to certain things without the need to contemplate on it. But then there's a different emotion, an emotion that's born only through contemplation. Like in Tanya, till chapter 18, he's talking all about moich shalat alev. He's talking about emotions as they're controlled or as they are generated by contemplation. In the words of the Rambam, how do you come to love and awe of God? How do you come to the love and awe of God? Through a person contemplating on the grandiosity of nature, the great design, which we've learned a number of times. You can discuss tzva hashamayim, tzva haaretz. You see things in creation, you see things that you can relate to, and you recognize, therefore you come to appreciate the godliness, and then come to actually love God. So it's a matter of chokhmah bina das, and it's important. Das is key, because das is the final step where you connect to the idea and you relate it to you, and that gives birth to emotions. So there's a Ru'usa Deliba in chapter 17 in Tanya, And here, level 2, that's coming through his bonus. And he explains it well on page 314 in volume 1, if you want to look it up. It comes through contemplation. Then there's a rusa deliba that's not born from the intellectual, the contemplative process. It's instinctively within the soul. There is a be'etzem, a love and connection to God. To reveal it, you may need contemplation, but there it's revealing, not giving birth to it. And that's the key distinction, understanding 2 levels of rusa deliba. So that helps understand the difference between level 2 here and level 3. And again, you can look it up there. And he actually says there, one is chaya and one is yechida. Chaya is still coming as a result of contemplation, maybe yediyas hashlila. Like he said here, it came from hasaga, from comprehension, he said, you come to hakara. But that's not the tachlis of Daas Elyon. That's not the amitis Daas Elyon. That's through contemplation. First, you relate the things to the divine that relates to you, till you come to a point where you recognize that which is l'mayla metam v'das. But that's also coming as a result of a contemplation. Whereas level 3 is Daas Elyon in its purest form, because it's not coming through our work. It's something that's directly connected between the neshama, the etzem of the neshama with the etzem of atzmus ein sof. And like he says in the parentheses, to reveal it, you need to connect to it, which means you need to do something. And this is the Avodah, he says clearly, is the Avodah of back there, Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur. Remember I mentioned Yom Kippur yesterday. So he says that explicitly. Level 3 is Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur. There's a special power. You still need Avodah to reveal it, but you're revealing the Etzem connection. So from chapter 18 and on in Tanya, then he moves to Ava Musateres, that in every Jew there's an essential love to God that may be concealed, but it's there. Whereas till chapter 18 in Tanya, he's talking about that which we can generate through our work. Now, obviously, the goal is to have both, but that helps explain somewhat these three levels that we discussed here. So we have Daas Tachton, Avedim, Tam V'das, our work, contemplating, discovering the godliness in existence. Then through the work, you come to understand the God beyond, the L'mayla Tam V'das, like he said, Kalim of Atzilus, connecting to that which is beyond Atzilus. And then comes the ultimate Daas Elyon, which is, so that's a nullification. Level 2 is a nullification, like Heder Tfisas Mokim, that you sense something completely beyond. That's like the hafla of Ein Sof. He actually speaks there about 2 levels. It has bonus be'inyan hafla, be'efen hafla. But that's not, I don't think that helps, it relates so much. I mean, it relates to this, but I don't want to go into the details. He does speak about 2 levels there. And then comes level 3, which is the etzem iskashrus, the etzem connection, the fundamental connection between God, between neshama and God. And that's the true Daas Elyon. That's what he calls the true Daas Elyon. So this is a summary. We're ready to continue, but being that there may be some questions, I'm happy to answer if anybody wants to ask anything.
The third level, you have, as you said, you still would need to maybe that intrinsic connection that we have with Atzmus is not revealed in every Jew. Doesn't seem to be. I mean, there are plenty of atheists or so on, and even deny it on a level. So there seems to be that there still needs to be some type, the avoda of removing any obstacles that prevent that from integrating in our lives. Was that be correct? There's still an avoda on that third level.
I just said that. I said he even suggests it right here. His gaus de madregezu zer shemiskasheres. As I said, on page 314, he speaks more at length about it, and the Rebbe's letter as well discusses it. That yes, you would need something to either remove an obstacle, like Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur. We know you could ask the same question. Yom Kippur, it says, "Itzume shel yom mechaper." The very day forgives because the etzem and neshama feels godliness. Now, the question is, does everybody feel it? Now, why do we have to go to shul? Because at the end of the day, you can have an etzem connection and you still have obstacles, like you said, or even if there's no obstacles, you still need to experience it. Remember, we don't live on the level of etzem. We live in the world of giluyim. So, But the difference is in level 1 and 2, we're not talking about the etzem. Level 1 and 2 is really our effort and our work. And the emotions are born through our contemplation. Here he made it clear. He says clearly, it's not b'chinas hasaga klal. There's no comprehension in this level of connection. If there's a hasaga, it's only to reveal, but it's not. The actual connection is not connected to hasaga. Tachas idea shalei neda are the words that he uses. Few times. Just go back to the words he says. Tachas das. He says these are shalei neda or musa klal. And then he goes and says it again. He says Yechida. It doesn't come from his bonus. It's there before his bonus. He says the soul itself connects. So it's not through any effort that makes the connection. The effort is only, like he says, yes, there may be a need to reveal it or to experience it or to, he doesn't say obstacles here, but that would also be included in that, yeah. I mean, if you learn Tanya, this is exactly Tanya. Till chapter 18, he doesn't talk about Etzem and Neshama. He talks about the avodah of giving birth to Midas, that everybody, everybody can have some experience, even if it's not full-blown emotions, at least enough to be a Beinani. In Perik Yud Ches, he begins a long discussion where he talks about, goes further now. He says to explain further, what's Ma'id? Why do you call it Ma'id? Because there is the Ava within us already. There he's just talking about what we have within us that's beyond what we achieve through our contemplation. At the end, you need both, but one is far more internalized. That's the first level. The second one is far more the essence of who you are, but that is in other words, we can't live on the level of Yom Kippur every day of the year. You know, if that was enough, why do we need the rest of the year? Okay, good.
So would you say that Geula is going to be Geula Shlema is when that level is going to be revealed to everybody? That's going to be what we'd say.
Geula Shlema, generally speaking, is the Etzem Begilu. You have both the qualities of both. Geula is not just the revelation of Etzem; it's the revelation of Etzem in a way that we can relate to. The Etzem and Neshama was there when Adam and Chava were created as well, and by Matan Torah and throughout history. You want it to be Dira B'Tachtenim. You don't just want Etzem and Neshama is there before the Tzimtzum. You want it all to come into this world in a way that we can experience it and act on it in an internalized and detailed way. Etzem alone does not need this whole shishtalshalus, and definitely not Tachtenim. You want it in this world in a structured way. So the answer is yes. In the Geula, everything will come together. That all the work we did, the small work we did, step by step, like we learned at length, the step-by-step process. And I will say this again because it's critical to say. It's not some type of reward at the end of the game where you get the prize, and that's that. This is all about your avodah. It's all about personal avodah, all these levels. I especially read a few days ago, I think on Sunday, I read from the Maimer of Shavuos, V'yadaita Ayin, that whole section, how you must go through step by step, or else he calls it false. He calls it delusional. That's what the Rebbe Rashab said, that if you don't go through the steps, whatever you achieve is delusional, because it's not you. The Etzem and Neshama was not created by us. No one needs us to have an Etzem and Neshama. That is a given. What we need to do is experience it and actualize it. And most importantly, that it should be completely internalized in our experience. So again, you cannot get around Avodah. Avodah is the heart of it all. Without that, God doesn't need us if there's no Avodah. He created existence. He can do whatever he wants. The whole point is that we should have a relationship with him on our terms. I mean, God can do anything. He doesn't need all these levels. He could just say, you know what? I'm going to reveal the Etzem, and that's that. So from time to time, a door opens up, like on Yom Kippur or other times in history or in the year, where you have a moment where the Yechida is shining, or easier to shine with less blocks if you open yourself up to it. Zichida can shine, but you could also have your eyes closed. So essentially, when we say that the Rebbe says that the Birurim are finished, that we're at the edge, we're at the threshold of Geula, it means because thousands of years, what kind of prices were paid, how much Aveda was done on all levels. So now you have a whole Ishtalshalos that's been saturated with Aveda and Aveda and Aveda, that each one on our level, like Zusha said, he's crying not why he won't be like some other tzaddik, why he's not living up to being like Zusha. That's what it comes down to. And that is absolutely part of the whole process. Or else you just jump to the Etzem. What do you need all these levels for? What do you need Daas Tachton, Daas Elyon, etc.? Okay.
Is it possible? He uses the Yechida Shabbanefesh, Iskashus Shabbanefesh, as being something similar to Hakara. Is it possible to distinguish between the two, how each one is achieved, or what the effective, or he doesn't say they're the same, he just uses as an example? Can we understand the differences?
Look, the words he uses here, when he gets to Masha Etzem HaNefesh Makir Umargish, you see that line? Atzmu Sein Sof. So he clearly is using the same words he used earlier with Das. Remember yesterday I had asked the question, why is this not Amunah? Why is this third level not faith? Why is he calling it Das? So the answer is because it's a hiskashus. It's not just we believe in something beyond us. The Etzem Neshama is bound. It's a being bound to. And remember, Das is hiskashus. So what he's doing here is taking Das and showing you that Das can be experienced on different levels. In the lower levels, Das is an active process on our part. Look, if you read the line right before that, he says there's a level, so there's one level of recognition of Das that comes after contemplation, after comprehension rather. In other words, this is the effort we make to not just learn a Gemara or a piece of Chassidus, but to actually bind ourselves with it, right? To be mekasher ourselves, to bind ourselves and feel it, that it means me, not just an idea, but it means me. It's mine, my father, okay? Boy. He says, however, the higher level of Daas Elyon, he also uses makir or margish, but he doesn't say it comes through our effort of recognizing. It's the natural recognition that a soul recognizes its father, or a soul recognizes the etzem. So he still uses hakara v'hargoshi. He says clear, makir margish atzmi mepnei zeu shosha mekere.
Yeah.
Ukamoy haiskashus atzmi. One second, let me finish. The neshama shezeh mitzad etzem neshama. Okay. There's loya yedei hizbonus, not even in the hafla. It's not about that you think your father is great or God is great. It's you're fundamentally connected. Okay. Now, then he says, after the parentheses, a few lines later, after he says, Shanefesh mitzad miskasheres ba'atzmu sein sof, and he again repeats, the be'etzem and mukusheres. Vayizgalus de madregazu zeu shemiskasheres. In other words, there's a fundamental connection, and then there's the so-called effort to connect to. But it's not an effort that's coming through contemplation. It's an effort that's coming to connect to the thing you're already connected to, be'etzem.
That's Yechida.
Let's say in Yom Kippur, Yechida is shining, so your work is to make sure that you feel and you experience that connection. But the connection is a fundamental one. Then he adds, Ukamoy Kain, hu ba'hakodesh shehanefesh mitzadatz me'makeres. So I think the Kamoy Kain should be read like this. If you really read it properly, and maybe this is good that you pointed it out, he begins with that it's a hakara v'hargosha. He says these words, makir u'margish atzmu sein sof. Then he says, so the makir u'margish is the das. he compares that Daas Elyon, the higher level, the third level, to now he compares ukamoi, that is like the iskashus atzmi. So the hakara and hargosha that a soul naturally has in atzmus, he says, is like the iskashus atzmi. Now, what that ukamoi means, he can explain different ways. I mean, I think he's basically associating that which we know elsewhere, that there's a fundamental connection. Now you're recognizing that connection. That's how I understand what he's saying. And that's when he goes back, ukamoi kain. The ukamoi haiskashus on that line, ukamoi haiskashus atzmi, the end of that is ukamoi kain hu ba'akara shebenefesh. He goes back and finishes what he began. Remember, this whole discussion starts with das and hakara. So now he's come to a level of hakara that's deeper than the hakara, the recognition and the personalization. What did I say? The das, the internalization. Huh?
Not sure.
Yeah. Once he explained that it's not like the hakara that comes after hasaga, after comprehension, so he now says it's hakara hargosha in the atzmus ein sof of the nef, like the hiskashus, and then he concludes with kamoi kenu b'hakara shebenefesh mitzad atzma makeres b'chinas atzmus ein sof. So I would say due to that hiskashus, that's why you have it, or you could say he's equating the two. That now you're recognizing that fundamental connection, not recognizing a depth and a connection to that comes through your hamoka, through your effort, but one that's natural. And then he goes with kumayal derech mashal hagosha shalev shalev margish mashe'ene yedeya. In other words, there's the hiskashus to the etzem and neshama to the atzmus, and there's the hakara of that. Hakara is not the recognition of the hiskashus that you just recognize atzmus, but hiskashus itself, you don't have the word hakara yet. So he's introducing hakara and equating the two. That's how I would explain this whole piece here.
I was wondering if the hakara is higher than the hiskashus of the yechida.
I don't know. Higher and lower, that I'll have to leave to smarter people than me. He doesn't speak about it. I'm not sure why we have to go into higher and lower. He's talking about the fact.
Okay. It seems like the hiskashus, this hiskashus, not, but you've mentioned several times the difference between that and the Muna. Muna remains a makif. This mamish takes the person entirely. Yeah, what's hakara? Hakara is he really recognizes it, sees it, takes him through and through. And a Muna has remained something beyond the makif. That's one of the things. And the comparison to what he said, this kashas atzmi, that sounds of the neshama, that sounds like the idea of a home, family. You have this kashas atzmi. It's that kind of effect on the person.
It's not that simple. Because it's not that simple. Because remember, it's due to this kashas atzmi which causes idin to be ma'minim b'nei ma'minim. It's in other words, there's a faith that follows reason, where reason leads you to the door of faith. But there's also namuna pshuta be'etzem haneshama mitzadet hiskashus. He doesn't talk about it here, but amuna itself could also be explained in several different ways. So I don't want to really talk about amuna because he doesn't talk about it here. I will say the following: this is the fundamental connection. It doesn't need to be understood because it's beyond knowledge. He says clearly it's beyond yudiyah, loy neda, but it's a hakara. It's a recognition. And he makes it clear. This hakara, he says clearly, margish masha'enu yedeya, v'harizeh mitzad yediyah klal, shari'enu yedeya mu'uma. Has nothing to do with what you know and what you're aware of.
Right.
It's just a fundamental recognition. It's like when you see your child, as I mentioned, let's say you see among 1,000 people, you suddenly see your son or your daughter, you don't need hisbanus. There's a fundamental recognition. This is my child. There's a fundamental connection, like he said, has nothing to do with yediyah. You don't have to know anything. Yeah, because this transcends knowledge in the conventional sense of knowledge. Yeah, it's very clear. He starts with hakara, that's higher than the lower level of Daas Elyon. He moves to hiskashus, goes back to hakara, gives the example of the lev yadeya, the heart just knows, and then concludes with the hakara, and that's amitis Daas Elyon. If you want the structure, that's how we build this this middle section on page 1180.
Okay, good. Thanks. That's important. I want to know that. Okay.
Okay. Now the Rebbe Rasha, besides tying together so many pages, he's now going to take this back to page 1134. If you go back to 1134, Aleph Kuf Lamed Daled, before the Rosh Hashanah Maimer, where he started the whole discussion of Daas Tachton and Daas Elyon. If you go back, okay, you'll see he talks about Das, where he starts talking about Das on page 1134, 1135, the Das that comes from Lechem. That when they left Mitzrayim, they ate Lechem in Haaretz. Then they got Lechem in Hashamayim. And both were there to bring them Das, an awareness, a deeper recognition. So if you look on page 1134, you'll see. Oh, just 1 second, 1 second. Oh, wow, I didn't even notice this. And I was talking about V'yadaita Ayin. The Rebbe Rashab does sum it up on 1132. 1 second. Okay, I'll look it up later. It's a whole piece here, which I overlooked. Anyway, if you look at page 1134, he says, from Zohar, the paragraph, the new paragraph on page 1134, he says, when they left Mitzrayim, they ate matzah, which is lechem in the Haaretz. And goes on to explain how Das comes through lechem. Because it's a level of chachma and so on. I'm not going to read it all, but if you read there, you'll see it's relevant to what we're going to learn now. That's why I'm going over it. Okay, and then he goes, that's Hametzi Lechem in Haaretz, fine, Nasibem Adas. Then he says, Ach Ayidei Lechem Zeh, that's 6 lines from the bottom. Higia Lehem Hasogev Adas, Rak Adahu Asar. Only to that level. That's what the Zohar says. No, they received Das, but it's only to a certain level. Listen to this. But however, God desired, He wanted them to have even more Das, even higher than Lechem in Haaretz, the Das that comes from heaven. And he said that Lo yochlu acha talmu b'chinas lechem animshech min hashamayim. And that's why didn't they continue just eating matzah or lechem in haaretz, bread? Because God wanted them to have now an experience of a higher level of das. And that comes from dafka, from lechem in hashamayim. That's a gift from above.
Is he distinguishing between Daas Tachton and Daas Elyon there?
1 minute. This is just the beginning of the subject.
Okay.
I'm going back, and you'll see the connection in a minute. I'm going to go over it now. Before we continue learning inside here, I'm going over what we learned there to make that connection. So he says now like this. Then he says, V'yesh levayed. I'm not going to read the whole thing. He says, now, and we can explain, this can be explained. These two inyanim, that first came lechem in haaretz, the bread from earth, and then, which is Hushayih Aveda B'Kayach Atzman. That means the Aveda should come through their own effort, not from bread from heaven, which was not their effort, that was from heaven. Lechem in Haaretz is Yitzias Mitzrayim, as they're going out of Egypt, of Mitzrayim, out of their limitations and constraints. So they're getting a das, an awareness of the divine that takes them out of the concealments. I'm reading from the bottom of page 1134. 1135. El Inyan Haveda Klal. When they were in Egypt, still in Mitzrayim, they were not capable, they were not shaykh to Aveda. And goes on then a whole piece about how Golus. Not going to read all of that, I'm just going to skip. On line 5 on that page. So even though they were great neshamas, hagam shoy neshamas gevayas, der midbar der dera, aber b'mitzrayim hoye tachlis hahelam, b'meicham v'libam. It was utterly concealed, an utter concealment in their minds and their hearts. That's Golus. You may recall he talks there a whole thing about sleep. I'm going to skip. I'm going down the page. After a long piece about sleep, then he goes back and says like this. So all this in Golus they did not have. Then he goes back and says like this. That's why Golus is compared to pregnancy as well. He brings there a whole thing with pregnancy. And then it continues. Okay. Then I'm now looking at page 1130. I'm just going. So there was Amunah, but there wasn't Das. That's what he says there. The end of page 1135. Amunah Pshuta. And the next page he says, Hagam Shamuna Zesu Yusaid. Even though faith is the foundation upon which everything is built and everything they grow afterwards, nevertheless, here's Kemunah Bamitis Nashim Yotz Bizgal Tekal Lamam. Yeah. And then he says how the Amunah brings to Das, but I want to skip again. I'm just going on and on and on. I just want to get to where I want to go to. 1 second. And then he goes, then when they left Mitzrayim in the middle of page 1136, and then he compares, says that's the Ayin of Sfiras Ha'emer. Okay. This is all the first level of Das. Okay, let me just continue. I'm just looking for where he goes back to Lechem and Hashemayim. Which I think is later in the Mimer.
They had to complain to get that Lechem in Shemayim.
1 second. Okay, this is all still this. Okay, then on page 1138 and 1139 is when he comes to the conclusion that all this was the first level of Das through Lechem in Haaretz. Then the Omer, fine. Okay, I'm reading now from the middle of page 1139. And now we're going to conclude what we learned here, and then I'm going to go back to where we're up to. Now he says, I'm looking at the line 1139, line that begins, all this is the work of refining the animal soul and getting out of the concealment and coming to an awareness of the divine that came when they left Mitzrayim. So then he says, Be'eze inyan shem is bein im begdulas Hashem bein brias b'savas elemis oy bein hagiluim. Basically, it comes through contemplation, whatever the form of contemplation it is, and that gives birth. And because he applied himself, you bound himself. But if you feel and relate and internalize, personalize this inyan, to the point that you get excited and stimulated in love and awe. And this love and awe that comes through contemplation, that reaches and pierces the midas, natural midas of the animal's soul. To separate the evil from the good, the birur, ubir chelke atev the nefesh habamis, liyashu gamken b'yiseris avla lekus b'chol avavcha b'shnei yitzarech. So now we've worked with, in the lower level, to transform the yesh, the nefesh habamis, to being a keli telekus. What we learned here on page 1179, Daas Tachton. That's what he said so far. Now he's going to connect it. Now he says the following. V'zeu ikas firas ha'emer. Okay, 7 midas, 7 times 7. Because through that comes the birur v'zichuch. This is bread from earth. Because through this, the bread comes a das, a recognition, and a divine comprehension. To the separation or clarity and refinement of the animal soul. That's matzah, the bread of the impoverished. Because it's eini. You're dealing with a dark situation, impoverished, and through that you're freeing yourself from that. Skafia. Then comes and afterwards they were given now the next level of das. Lechem min hashamayim, the bread from heaven. V'hu b'chinas hamshachem al mayla lamata. Not aveda b'kei chasme like he said from the bottom up. Now it's hamshachem al mayla lamata. Dihine ha'asaga shem b'chinas lechem min ha'aretz zeu ba'lakusha b'chinas islapshus be'elamis. The comprehension that comes from the bread from earth is in the divine as it manifests in the world. That's the work of the divine soul to refine, to clarify or to separate and refine the animal soul. However, bread from heaven, the bread from heaven is to bring a das and asaga, a recognition and a comprehension that's higher than the existence. This is the work of the divine soul on its own, not as it relates to the animal soul. And he says, "I must go to b'teir v'yesh leimer so inyan reusa deliba." This is reusa deliba, level 2 that we just learned about. Okay. Now comes, listen to this. Turn the next page, 1140. Go to the bottom of 1140. How is he going to explain this? The explanation of this that we just spoke, lechem min hashamayim, lechem min haaretz, who dihine bezi dias hanal, these 2 levels of das. What? Lechem min haaretz and lechem min hashamayim, hein mashakosov keil deas havaya v'lo niskanu aliles, that this is Daas Elyon and Daas Tachton. That's the connection. So everything we learned about lechem min hashamayim, lechem min haaretz back there, now he connects to Daas Tachton, Daas Elyon, which then leads us to the discussion of yesh, ayin, and yesh. Everything we learned in the last like I said, the 40 pages, something like 40 pages. And that brings it all together. That's why I wanted to review it. And now let's continue reading where we are now on page 1140. I'm sorry, 1180. That was 1140, following the whole discussion. That's why I wanted to do this, what I just said, because he's bringing together the whole subject of Yedaita Yem Avayu Elikim and the Daas Elyon Daas Tachton of bread from heaven, bread from earth, and bread from heaven. And look now what he says. V'zeu habeis yediyas. This is now literally summing up what we just read on 1134. Aleph Kuf Lamed Dalet. Yeah. There's a 2 days. Remember, it started at 1134. There's the day that only reaches the level of Malchus. That's bread from heaven, matzah. There's the level that goes beyond. That's Lechem min hashamayim. And then on page 1140, he spelled it out. That is Daas Elyon, Daas Tachton. And now he concludes the Rebbe Rashab. V'zeu habeis yediyas the lechem min ha'aretz v'lechem min hashamayim shenizbar li'il dibra maschel atem netzavim. What I just read was all from atem netzavim. So now that we've learned all this, this is the difference. These are the two yediyas, the two perceptions, the two awareness, the two levels of das, the bread from earth and the bread from heaven that we learned back in that Maimer. B'shem HaZoyar Parsha Tetzah, Parsha Vayetze. That was the Zoyar he cited on page 1134. You can look at it. That's the connection here. The Hainu. Beis Hadei is the Daas Elyon v'Daas Tachton. These are the two levels of Das. The higher level of Das, the lower level of Das. Lechem min ha'aretz hi ha'yediyah, the Daas Tachton. The bread from earth, is the awareness or the das, the idea, the recognition that comes from of das Tachton, of the lower perspective. That relates to the birurim. You eat a piece of bread, you digest it, even on a physical level. In Aveda, it's the Aveda of separating the spark and not just eating to indulge, but directing the nefesh habamis to recognize the divine within the bread. That's a rational, step-by-step process of looking at existence, looking at the world around us, and coming to understand through seichel. We're not talking about Amunah, we're not talking about Daas Elyon now. We're talking about understanding through your contemplation, through your work. That's what it calls the Tam V'Das. The Das, the idea, the Aveda al Pitam V'das. He explains in the parentheses, V'hi hamshachas moichin lezah, shezeh inyan sfiras ha'emer mashin is barasham. And what is the Aveda? That you're drawing down moichin, you're contemplating on it, and you're drawing it into the midas of the animal soul to refine it. That's sfiras ha'emer. Like he explained back there. Sfiras ha'emer is taking the moichin and refining the 7 times 7 midas. Chesed shechesed to malchus sheba malchus equals 49 days of Omer. So after Yetzias Mitzrayim, they ate matzah, then they counted the Omer, all the Avodah of Das Tachton, of refining the person and refining and elevating and revealing the divine within existence. Remember, the beginning of this Maimer, he said Das connects. Why did he say it connects? Meichin to Midas. He also said connected Chochmah to Bina. He says that's Das Tachton. That's how Das is in the structure that's not beneath Keser. Chochmah Bina Das. Das connects Chochmah Bina. And Meichin Amidas. Ushati Amshach Gam B'Bchinas Malchus. And that the Amshach should also be in the level of Malchus. If you go back in that Maimer, Atem Nitzavim, it's all about the level of Lechem min ha'aretz. Aretz is Malchus. So we're talking about drawing down and revealing the divine through our work, Mamata Lamaya, Das Tachton, of revealing the divine and refining the material world. After the parentheses, through this comes that mamish, the birur, the clarity, the separation of the chumnius, of the crassness of the animal soul, and not just in the animal soul, but all the dvarim hatachtenim, all the physical matters below that we engage in, sheyukelim lelakus, that they should be containers to the divine. Basic avodah. We live in a world that's a world of arrogant world, a hostile world, a corrupt world, a world of yeshus. And the job is to turn the world, the material world, directed toward its source, toward the divine. This is the hard work of Birur Nefesh Abamis. This is Lechem in Earth-Daas Tachton. Like we said, expression, Birur Haguva Nefesh Abamis, to refine or clarify the body and the animal soul, and Chelke Be'olam, and your part in the world, which is the Dvarim Tachtenim, anything you're involved in, business, eating, sleeping, drinking, everything we engage in this material world, to make them Kelim Lelakus. And through this is the unification of Havaya and Elikim. Havaya is the divine higher level. Elikim is the divine concealed in existence. Shiluv Havaya ba'adnai, to reveal and intertwining of Havaya in Adnai. Which is drawing and revealing the oir that is there, and say the shtalshus that was placed there and is embedded in existence. But now through the Aveda, when you eat the food or the lechem, and you're becoming aware of hameitzi lechem in haaretz, that God is the one that draws the lechem in haaretz, hameitzi pi Hashem, the divine. So you've done that Aveda of Das Tachton, which is Yichud Havaya Elikim in Shiluv Havaya ba'adnai. Now he's going to go back. I'm going to stop here, but I'll just, the lechem in Hashemayim ubchinas Daas Elyon, and the bread from heaven, that's the higher perspective. V'hu hayediyah, I'll just read a few lines in, so we'll flow from there tomorrow. This is the awareness. This is not an awareness that from dark to light, from bad to good, from a concealed state to a revealed state, which is level 1. Now you're talking, you already know that there's an elikus. Like you said earlier, is the Aved of the Nefesh Elikis itself. But now you're coming to recognize that though, yes, you're in a divine state, but this state, compared to higher states, is Kula Kamei Kala Chashiv. You're aware that everything, even in Gedusha, even in Atzilus, is all nullified completely, Kala, like as if nothing compared to higher levels. So this is a bitl, not a bitl hayesh, yesh to ayin. This is in the ayin, you're coming to recognize that which is higher than the ayin, higher levels. This is also a yichud of Havaya and Elikim, but this time it's shiluv adnai and Havaya, not Havaya and adnai. The lower level of the divine, as is getting encompassed in its source in Havaya. That's the words he used. That's the level of iskalus, like he said at the top of this page, the bottom of last page. Encompassed, absorbed in. That's the bitl of the kelim, not the bitl of the yesh, the kelim of Atzilus, the yesh hanetzal you wish. I'll read one more line. And what's achieved when you do this Aveda, this higher level of bittul? Now you're not getting just the oir that was concealed and revealed within existence. You're getting sheirish shemokra er, the root and source of where the air originated from. And he's going to say that this is the difference between chitzenius akeser and chitzenius atik, all the way to chitzenius averi and stuff. I'm going to stop here because this needs already more explanation connecting to He's connecting now all the dots, all the pages we learned until now. So that's where it's all coming together. Everything we